at the basis of sociobiology, and is based, as I will point out to you, on a whole series of misconceptions. Hamilton and his pupil Richard Dawkins believed that bees die after stinging an insect which attacks their hives. This is the kamikaze bee that Dawkins made famous in the selfish gene. And that this altruism explained by the fact that they're 75% genetically identical with their sisters because of this curious method of sex determination. This gave rise to this idea of kin selection, which gave rise to the selfish gene. Actually, it's all nonsense. Bees don't die when they sting other insects. Bees die when they sting elastic-skinned mammals like us, because they have an arrow-shaped sting and they can't get it out. And therefore, they pull out their hindguts and die. All bad beekeepers, such as me, who have had fighting around their hives and who look at the dead bees, can see that they haven't died from stinging. They've died from being stung, because their hindguts are not sticking out. Stinging humans is of no evolutionary significance to bees, who've been about for very much longer than humans, and therefore they do not commit suicide when they defend their hive against other insects. Termites, which don't have haploid males, have very similar behavior, and the other great illusion is this idea that the virgin queen, when she mates only with one drone, the fastest flying, a perfect example of sexual selection. In fact, once one had cameras which could actually take pictures of the event, the Virgin Queen behaves like the whore of Babylon and mates with every drone in sight. And possibly, actually, most of the sperm are left by the last drone, which perhaps is not what evolutionary speculation might have suggested. So one can really forget about a great deal of this. But it was on the basis of this that group selection was rejected in the 1960s, largely by Edmund Wilson. But Edmund Wilson, together with David Sloan Wilson, who was always, I think, on the other side, has in fact had a Wittgensteinian conversion on this point. And in a much more recent publication, they've come to the conclusion that this was evolution's wrong turn in the 60s. And group selection does take place, that selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and everything else is commentary. That's a direct quotation. It's not clear that others, for example, Richard Dawkins, have yet accepted this Wittgensteinian conversion, but Edmund Wilson, who started it all, certainly has. So he no longer rejects this. Now, humans, in contrast to bees, the variations between different groups is determined culturally, not genetically, and that can be shown by the homologue of the requeening experiment, and done, for example, by Carlton Gajdusek, the man who first studied Kuru in the New Guinea Highlands, one of the most primitive societies known, who brought back a large number of children and sent them to college in America, and lo and behold, they didn't end up as New Guinea Highlanders, they ended up as American college students, and had acquired by their education all the cultural characteristics that this involves. So this experiment in humans gives exactly the same opposite result. And now natural selection and cultural evolution is different from that in genetic evolution, where the phenotype follows the genotype automatically, but to allow culturally determined variation to undergo selection, as I've already told you, the variants have to be preserved over a lot of people and a lot of generations for selection actually to have an effect. And these cultural patterns of behavior have nearly always been expressed in the form of religious prescriptions. And the generation of these cultural variants and their enforcement, I will argue, have given religions a vital evolutionary function. And I will give you a timeline again for this. If you now regard the existence of Homo sapiens sapiens as a year, the first probable religious artifacts about 10 months ago, burials at the Adzi cave in Israel. I'm indebted to my wife, who is an archaeologist, for all these figures. The Venus figurines in Europe about 5 months ago. The first ritual structures at Catalhoyuk about 3.5 weeks ago. The first monotheistic religion, Akhenaton in Egypt, about 10 days ago. And there are probably no older extant religions at the moment than that. So in fact, the religions we know about are all extremely recent. Unfortunately, if we accept the fact that religion has been maintaining cultural evolution for a long time, we have this disadvantage that we don't actually know the prescriptions of many of these much older religions because nobody wrote them down. We know about their artifacts and we know a bit about their ritual, but we know very little about their prescriptions. So a religion, I'm happy with Samuel Johnson's definition of religion, which is virtue based upon the reverence of God and expectation of future punishments, rewards and punishments, except I will point out in a moment, of course, not all religions have gods, though most contemporary ones do. And virtue, as Samuel Johnson uses, encapsulates the behavioral prescription, the thou shalt and thou shalt not, and that is the core of all existing religions, and I will argue probably of all earlier ones too. And as far as I'm concerned, virtue is essentially the same as ethics. This is actually defining ethics. This gives ethics a definition. This definition suits me fine, but the philosophers present may find it a little oversimplistic. The virtue deals with rather particular topics in nearly all religions, which are things which are important in life. They lead to diet and health, to reproductive behavior, to interpersonal relationships, to attitudes to work, to attitudes to death and suicide, and a variety of other things. I have tables of this too, which my wife prepared, but I don't have time to show them to you. It's a pity. I'll just point one thing to you. Of the extant religions, it's really quite interesting. Christianity is the only religion that has no prescription with regard to washing, which is quite interesting, but they've nevertheless survived. You would have thought it was a disadvantage. Virtue, however, in all religions is very concerned with increasing population. And the ethical paradigm of all existing religions is that of an endangered species. Males having to feed and defend their mates, and females their primary obligation to breed. And I always point out that this is recognized in the Norse religion, that Valhalla is reserved for men who die in battle and women who die in childbirth. Unfortunately, this paradigm has for the last 200 years become unadaptive, as I will explain in a moment. The rest of religion, the reverence of God and expectation of future rewards and punishments. As I say, not all religions have gods. The original form of Buddhism didn't. Confucianism, which in my terms is certainly a religion, didn't either. Many, but not all religions believe in an afterlife. Others believe in reincarnation. 3 minutes. I shall be 5. The will of God and hopes and fears enforce the prescription by a mixture of wish fulfillment, fear fulfillment, and unfortunately frequently a great deal of actual physical coercion. The mystical superstructure does not have to be accurate, as I point out here with a couple of examples. The prescriptions were very successful. We don't have to believe the mythical superstructure. But it does need to be effective. If religions don't preserve their prescriptions, then they will lose their function, and that explains the fact that religions are intolerant. And that gives rise to severe problems of religions, fundamentalism, persecution, and wars, but I regard this as the toxic side effects of a medicine we need, whereas people like Richard Dawkins regard this as pure psychopathology, but it is a downside which is rather unfortunate. But a religion showing unlimited tolerance to other religions would lose its functions. How does religious innovation arise? Well, probably not in most cases by prophets going into the desert to speculate how their descendants in the nth generation are going to survive, though Buddha did think about what was needed to achieve nirvana, and it's probable that the innovations are Popperian in nature, they're random or due to irrelevant reasons, and the reasons for their introduction are rarely, if ever, related to their advantage. I give male circumcision here, and God knows why. Nobody knows why it was introduced, but it probably survived because it gives resistance to sexually transmitted disease. And apropos of something that John said, cannibalism probably died out because those who practiced this developed spongiform encephalopathies and died, and so they left no descendants. So those that didn't do cannibalism did better. The implications of this hypothesis, very briefly, is there must be a degree of free will, which is why some theologians don't find this altogether unacceptable. Genetic determinism of behavior can be rejected. Religions need to be intolerant, and ethics forms the basis of selection. And this is where I disagree totally with T.H. Huxley, who wrote the first book on ethics and evolution in 1893, and he says that ethics is there to counteract the cosmic struggle, that we have ethics to prevent evolution getting out of hand. Of course, he didn't know about cultural evolution, didn't know about genetic evolution either, because nobody knew about genes. But I think this is totally wrong. And as the minister actually said this morning, I was pleased to hear, ethics evolve. It's quite clear that ethics evolve like everything else evolves. Huxley regarded ethics as fixed and probably derived from God. Not quite sure about that. And this view is still held by those who believe in natural law, who believe in a fixed ethics. But you really can't take this too seriously. Even in historical times, cultures have held widely different views, I say here, on slavery, human sacrifice, cannibalism, suicide, and lots of other things. And you really have to take the strange view that our ancestors were all moral imbeciles if you believe they had our ethics and totally failed to observe them. And that really is a very ethnocentric and very unreasonable view. So the ethics have changed, they get better. Well, sometimes they get worse. One of the problems of the 20th century is that we had ethical experiments that were quite horrific, and which fortunately none of them lasted very much. I mean, the view that the fetus is ensouled at conception, which gives the Roman Catholic Church so much trouble, was a 19th century invention by Pius IX when he tried to keep up with 19th century embryology. He didn't keep up with it far enough, unfortunately. Concept of human rights has evolved since the European Enlightenment, as you all know. And those ethical rules that have survived over most cultures and over longest periods of times are those we now regard as universally applicable. That's an entirely acceptable argument. I won't say anything about this in the secular world. There is some separation from church and state, but I would point out to you that it is the norm in modern secular society for skeptics like me, like John Harris, to accept the ethical prescriptions of the religions they grew up among, which after all have evolved and which we think are good and proper, without believing any of their superstructure. That isn't just common, it's the norm. It's very few skeptics who actually reject the religious prescription in general, especially its more important parts. There are odd bits they will. On the future, well, I've said, this is really where we come to this meeting, last minute. Increasing population has undermined the ethical paradigm which underlines all modern religions, that of an endangered species. We're now an endangering species. This needs to change. That change will affect the right to breed. It will affect the working of democracy between groups, not within groups. One cannot allow groups who refuse to contain their populations to dictate to those who don't, and it will change the world relation between man and the physical environment. I might just point out that women's liberation and gay rights are both parts of this paradigm change that have occurred, so it's not all bad. These are not new ideas, but they were unadaptive in the past. And the secular religions of the 20th century show that cultural evolution can take serious wrong turns. But as I've already said, this is the last slide we put here, the essential problem which this meeting has to face, already been said by John Sulston, is to control population growth or to reverse it, which will require substantial changes to religious and ethical prescriptions. All other changes to a green economy are secondary and will at best delay the anticipated apocalypse by a few years. Doesn't mean they're not worth doing, but they're very limited use. And one very final point to something that John Sulston says, the projections for the growth of human population have, of course, declined considerably in the last 20 years. And this is ascribed, on the one hand, to increased education of women, and the other to increased affluence. And I think that a prescription that says we should try to reverse the increase of affluence as a method of controlling the green economy may have unfortunate side effects on population growth, and we should really think about that very carefully. Thank you very much.